Hello, welcome. I'm Masood Raja, and in this brief lecture, I'll be introducing you to Ngugi Thiong'O's essay, Creating Space for 100 Flowers to Bloom. And I will also upload or give you the link to the essay so that you can read it. The best way of understanding the essay, of course, is if you read it first and then watch the video. And it will also be interesting to compare it with the Chinwei Zhu lecture that I already provided you, because he is kind of building in the same tradition but slightly differently. Now, those of you who are not familiar with Ngugi Thiong'O's work, he is from Kenya, one of the most prominent African writers, famous for quite a few novels, especially The Devil on the Cross. Now, in this particular essay, Ngugi is dealing with the question of culture, but transnationalism of the culture. Okay, so the way the essay is argued is he lays down where the world is now, right? So he basically tells us, the world is becoming smaller because of the modes of communication, travel. People can travel from one place to another, unlike the main character in Around the World in 80 days. You can do it in less than 80 days. And remember, this is probably written pre-internet. Now, actually not pre-internet, but internet now has the world even smaller. In that world, then, what he's saying is there has emerged a global economy. Right now, we know that that economy is predominantly governed by states from Europe and North America, but still there are things that are ubiquitous everywhere. Most of them are probably terrible, but McDonald's and Walmarts and commodities, right? And along with that, while this global economy exists and it might still serve the purpose of the former colonial powers, what it has made possible is also sharing of the vocabularies of resistance, right? So, things like a mandala, right? A luta continua. These were struggle continues, right? Or the fight is on. Power to the people. These are the vocabularies that were developed in Africa, but people use them in America, they use them in Canada, in France. So while the world is becoming closer, and the global culture is developing into a large, unequal, but large connected culture, along with the possibilities of control are also the possibilities of resistance, which can now also be globally shared, right? And he then goes on to tell us that, yeah, the world is still economically and politically dominated by the West. And then he goes on to the question of literature, right? And his idea about literature is that literature also has a global and kind of a universalistic heritage, right? And in which you can see people all over the world reading the same books, talking about the same books, still Eurocentric, still dominated by what used to be the colonial languages. But his point is that in this global culture, if people only read literatures produced in Europe or in America without infusion of knowledges from Africa and elsewhere, then since that humanistic tradition, the European humanistic tradition, is built on those exclusions of African history, exclusions of Asian history, or any other histories, then the view that literature will then represent is distorted. They are actually consuming then the colonizers' way of looking at the world, right? The dominant group's way of looking at the world. And what his point is that African literatures and Asian literatures can enrich that tradition, infuse it with these silenced knowledges. And then he gives us the 3 stages of native production of literature. The first, of course, is the oral tradition, which is connected deeply to native cultures, especially in Africa, where most languages had not been reduced to writing. So before the colonizers came in, there was a living culture of storytelling in different African cultures. There used to be festivals. Storytellers were famous and prominent for their role. Right now, when that tradition gets disrupted, right, and colonial educational system is mandated, the second stage of African writing, according to Ngugi, emerges, and that is African writers writing in colonial languages, in French, in English, in other languages. And what his point is that, okay, maybe they still rely on the native tradition, but it is Caliban, taking from the Tempest, serving still the interests of the European masters, because what they are doing is, while they are writing their novels of Africa in English, they are borrowing from the oral tradition, right? Things Fall Apart is a great example of that. There are so many proverbs, right? You might have been given an assignment of listing those proverbs. But what he says is that what that ends up doing is, first of all, other than offering these exotic tales now told by the native storytellers, they end up enriching the European languages. Now, there is nothing wrong with it, but they are not enriching the native languages, right? And then the third phase of cultural production in the former colonies for Ngugi is when African writers write in their own languages. And what does it do? What he's suggesting is not a nativistic or purist return to writing in Africa, but taking what you have from the world, right, but rendering it into your own language. So you reverse that process. Instead of enriching the European languages, now you can enrich your own language. You can develop the tradition of storytelling. Now, he already acknowledges that there are certain constraints in Africa, publishing itself, having a reading public. All of those problems are there, but what he's suggesting is that writing in African languages is culturally and politically important for Africa, and it's worth the effort, right? So that people living in Kenya, living in Nigeria, living in Somalia can read literature in their own languages, and in the process of doing that, be connected to their own history. And it doesn't matter if it's formalistically something drawn from Europe, at least it's rendered in native language, and it enriches the native language and culture. His point is that right now in the Western Academy or in the Western world, anyone can claim to be an expert on Africa or India or Iran without even knowing the languages, because what they've already assumed is that everything should be available in the colonial languages. But if more and more African novelists and writers produce in their own native languages, right, then no one can simply claim expertise in West African literature without knowing 1, 2, or 3 of West African languages, and that would then enhance the local cultures and maybe disrupt that disparity, that hierarchical disparity between the West and the rest of the world. And then, his final argument is that, world is connected, and it's like a garden, and that every language should have a space in it. And I will, cut from here and read the last passage because that's very instructive, and then come back and sum this up. Ngugi's conclusion: the wealth of a common global culture will then be expressed in the particularities of our different languages and cultures, very much like a universal garden of many colored flowers. The flowerness of the different flowers is expressed in their very diversity, but there is cross-fertilization between them, and what is more, they all contain in themselves the seeds of a new tomorrow. So in this final concluding passage, what becomes really clear is that Ngugi Thiong'O is not a nativist, not a purist, so not quite as radical as Chinwezu, right? But he's also not in the camp of people like Chinua Achebe and others who believe that English is good enough to carry the burden of their own culture. What he's trying to suggest is that the creation of a space for African culture within this larger common culture, which is unequal, depends upon the native Africans from different countries of Africa cross-fertilizing their own languages by borrowing from others, right? But writing in their own languages so that African literature and African culture can also have its place in this large garden called the world. Now remember, when he plots it as a garden, there is no hierarchy involved there. Everyone has a plot and a space, and they are on the same plane. So I think that's a wonderful conclusion to Ngugi's argument. And do keep in mind that in 1970s, Ngugi Thiong'O decides to change his name from James Ngugi to Ngugi wa Thiong'O, right? And writes his first novel in Gikuyu, which is later he himself translates as The Devil on the Cross. And so he actually went and did what he proposes here. But more importantly, what happened to the novel is a deeply interesting story, because after he published it, he had trouble publishing it. There weren't many local publishing institutions, or people were not interested in it. But after he publishes it, this written novel becomes a narrative tale, right? Because people start reading it in the bars, on the farms, in the villages. The novel then becomes a folk tale because it is written in Gikuyu, which is a native language. And that is a great example of a native African language novel, right, which is borrowing the form, right, from the West, the novelistic form, but telling a quintessentially Kenyan story, right? And so that in itself teaches us that writing in native languages, as far as Ngugi Thiong'O is concerned, it's not just theoretical, done carefully, right? It actually can transform a reading culture, but also create Africa's place within what he calls our common humanity or a common global culture. That's all for now. I hope this was useful. If you have any questions, please send them my way and I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you so much, and see you next time.